You are listening to the Cultural Providers Network podcast, a Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health production, building and sustaining a network of culturally and ethnically diverse voices to promote policies, practices, standards, and research that improve the mental health of children, their families, and communities.
This podcast is brought to you by the Minnesota Department of Health. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Providers Network podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Jones, and this podcast is sponsored by MACMA, Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. And on today's podcast, we're going to be talking to Joel, who is one of the original stakeholders in the Cultural Providers Network from years ago. This project has taken new life over the years, but we're going to get a historical perspective on today's podcast. Joel, can you introduce yourself, who you are, what you currently do, and how did you get connected to the Cultural Providers Network?
Hi, folks. I'm Joel Hetler. By training, I was a clinical psychologist. For the first 30 years of my career, I worked Ramsey County Human Services, and I was the founder of their Children's Mental Health System of Care project and the Ramsey County Children's Mental Health Collaborative. The last 15 years of my career, I know I'm old, that's a lot of years. The last 15 years of my career, I was at the University of Minnesota, first as director of the Center for Excellence in Children's Mental Health, which primarily provided education about evidence-based practices and research to the children's mental health community. And then later, I was part of a research team that worked on a variety of different projects for adolescent health, mental health. Did you want me to cover more than that, Brandon? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I said, no, that's perfect. That's good background. Thanks for sharing that with us. I didn't realize that you spent both time in Hennepin and in Ramsey County, so you've been able to see both sides of the river and some of the things that are happening. Could you share with us some of the early stages of development of the Cultural Providers Network? My understanding is that there was a grant that came early on in the process to help really uplift the work, but how did it all come together?
So, really, the forerunner of the CPN was the cultural committee of the Ramsey County Children's Mental Health Collaborative, and when we were building the Children's Mental Health Collaborative, those of us who were in leadership thought it was really, really important that we had representatives of the entire community at the table, not just the main institutional players. So we went out of our way to engage Thad Wilderson Associates, La Familia Guidance Center, some of the other the Wilder Southeast Asian programs, some of those programs, and so at that collaborative, we began a discussion about what did it mean to provide relevant services in cultural communities. And when I retired from Ramsey County and went to the university, I wanted to take that work with me. And in addition, I wanted to add the research background piece that the university could bring to the table. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was still doing a fair amount of work with Roberto Avina, who was one of the directors of the La Familia Guidance Center. So Roberto and I sat down and talked about what could we do to bring the BIPOC community, the service community, in closer contact in a meaningful way with the university knowledge base. And the CPN was our attempt to do that. So we mobilized our resources, went through our contact list, invited as many people as we could find to the origins of the CPN, which was when I was first at the university. So actually some of the first meetings were at the U. And in my capacity at the U, I was able to get a grant that really it was for facilitation of the project, and it was about I guess what now you would call courageous conversations. How could people get together from really very, very diverse backgrounds and deeply listen to each other and really try and understand each other's perspective? Because we really felt that was going to be, if we were going to be successful as a network, we had to be successful at really listening to each other. So we were able to hire a facilitator who was trained in this methodology, and we spent at least a year, I think, having these kind of conversations. So some people were a little frustrated because we weren't doing anything, but we were doing really important work, pre-work that was necessary for the Culture Providers Network to go on from there.
Yeah. Some of those courageous conversations, I know that's the title we use today, but you go over pioneers in doing that in the mental health space. I would assume that they were pretty challenging at that time. We're in a very different space today when it comes to mental health care, even cultural awareness, and to have those conversations and to bring people together. I'm sure that those are some interesting dynamics that were taking place at that time. Plus, that we were at a different space with the DSM at that time.
Yeah.
We were, I think, if the years line up the way that I understand them, that was about 2008-ish, 2009, maybe something like that. Yeah.
I think 2008.
Yep, 2008. So, we're thinking about just what are the current, if we could take a time machine, some of the current things that were happening at that time when it came to mental health world and young people's, especially the ADHD was hot. Understanding autism as a spectrum was starting to happen. Like there was a lot of things taking place at that time. Yeah, so I can imagine. And then you had the cultural dynamic on there. It probably brought forth some very interesting times.
And in the community, big changes were happening because that's when significant numbers of young Somalis started entering or I should say young East African kids started entering the system. And we already had the earlier waves of Hmong. And I got to watch in Ramsey County what a bad job we did responding to that. And so that was one of my goals is that the CPN would support a more robust response to as the community changed, that the mental health response changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's interesting how time goes. Those are my up and coming years. So I remember being a young person during those years, both when the Hmong community, we had a lot more Hmong people migrate to and immigrate to the state of Minnesota. Those are my elementary school years. And then later on in high school and college, we have this East African movement just come to Minnesota and just seeing how the community dynamic shifted. I can only imagine from a social services standpoint what that response is. You're still recovering from the massive Hmong movement that we had come in. And now you have a whole nother group of people who speak another language coming in as well. And you're providing services as well as all the other folks you're providing services for. In the Twin Cities as well. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure that was interesting.
Yeah, well, no surprise. There were many people in human services who had good intentions, but our ability to really respond and meet the needs of the community was very limited. And it's grown, I think, over the years. I hope you're more current than I am on that. But there was nothing when we first started this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that it's definitely grown. And I would say that we've taken a turn in our efforts to make sure that cultural services are present, or there's at least attempts to have them over the years. I think CPN played a huge role in that. They probably doesn't get enough credit, but the other thing that took place obviously was the death of George Floyd. After George Floyd was murdered here, everyone hopped on the cultural wave and we need to have better services. And then we're in the middle of the pandemic and you have this massive finally response from community and society that says, hey, I need to talk to somebody. I need a therapist.
Yeah.
I need to, level out and deal with my mental health. And people are using the term mental health publicly. They're sharing that they're looking for a therapist. Like it's what we've been waiting for in the mental health world for so long. It finally happened, and we were not prepared. We don't have enough therapists in general. We definitely don't have enough cultural providers or even folks who speak more than one language. So we have this high level of demand and this, need of supply, which is a very different experience versus 2008, where you have services, but you don't have the connections to the community. So we've kind of just morphed into a new dynamic today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a better place to be, but
Mm.
it was unfortunately terrible things had to happen to move us there.
Right. It's kind of odd how that ends up happening.
Yeah.
In the work that we do.
Yeah.
Could you share your perspective on why multicultural perspectives and services are important? We know that many different communities go through challenges, but from your perspective and the work that you've done, why is it important to have multicultural perspectives in this work?
Well, you have to bear with me a little bit.
That's fine.
I had an answer and slipped my brain. Just a sec. So it's a critical piece. I'm of a generation where I grew up without having a clue about white privilege or white male privilege. I just took advantage of it without and all the kind of stuff that everybody knows about now about microaggressions and intersectionality and all. I didn't know about any of that stuff,
Yeah.
and I wasn't even aware that I had racist thoughts. I grew up in a liberal family, so I thought, oh, I'm good, and it was quite an eye opener when I began to understand that the world was much more complex than what I had thought, and that although there are some basic human feelings, emotions, concerns that we all share, there are some really big differences among people, and their cultural background is a huge player in that. And that without the ability to listen deeply to each other, the divide was just too great to be successful as a therapist. And so I think that's why multicultural perspective is really important, and it's something that everybody needs because Brandon, if you were going to be a therapist for my kids, you'd need to really understand their world. It's the same way that I would if I was there for your kids, and so I think it's not a skill that we're necessarily born with. If you're in a marginalized community, you have more awareness as you're growing up that there are differences between you and the mainstream narrative. I'm Jewish by background, and so I had some awareness of that, but I'm still a white guy, and so my awareness was limited, but it was at least there.
Right.
So it's not been a huge eye opener to me to know that I had a lot to learn, but learning that is always difficult. And there are so many communities. Every time you think you've mastered it, like there's not a single Hispanic perspective. There's not a single African perspective, Asian perspective, or even a Caucasian perspective. There's so many different ones that it clearly helps to have broad cultural knowledge, but it's not enough because everybody has a unique cultural and personal background that you have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Yep, that's one of the things I do in my work, and I try to lead from this space as well, is having, like you said, the key thing, having just kind of a broad cultural knowledge base or understanding, but connecting with people based on their worldview. How are they operating, and how do they see the world through their own perspective and eyes or lens, as we like to use in our world. And that's been a huge benefit for myself, because I don't understand every cultural dynamic that I've engaged with, even from a counseling perspective. When I did do clinical therapy, I worked with folks from all different backgrounds, and I always started with building a rapport and trying to build a relationship first, and then go from there, and use whatever general knowledge I have. Of course, you're going to make some assumptions when you do that, but you fact check based on your relationship and the rapport that you're building. That's always steered me pretty well when engaging with folks from different cultural backgrounds, and to be honest, even with the same background as myself as an African American man. I want to ask a question about changes or improvements that you think the mental health field needs to do. Like, we know that um, BIPOC services and BIPOC providers are important, but are there things that you've seen? I know you've been retired for a while, but are there things that you've come across with, conversations with colleagues, or just some of your work you've done at the University of Minnesota, where you're like, this field has to focus better on these things? What are some of the areas that should be considered for improvements when it comes to mental health?
So I have a couple of things I want to highlight. The first is about when I was at Ramsey County, the services that the county provided were for kids who had really already had awful things happen to them, and life had really crippled them in a lot of ways, or maybe not crippled, but it had given it their huge barriers that they have been struggling with for a long time. And the truth was that often we didn't have a clue what was needed, or if we did have an idea what was needed, we really didn't know how to provide it.
Yeah.
And so I work with good people who had good intentions, and we struggled very hard to help the kids and families get their needs met. But it was always an uphill battle. When I went to the U, I had the privilege of being able to be involved in more thinking and discussion about early years and about the impact of what happens to kids when they're quite young, and what a great place that is to do successful intervention. And now we're not necessarily talking about kids who have clinical disorders. We're talking about kids who are more at risk.
Mhm.
Although maybe that's not always such a popular term anymore, but kids who are suffering adverse life experiences,
Right.
and really, is there ways that we can help inoculate kids and help and even more so help their families to help them? And so I think that's a huge piece, and that's a piece that's particularly important in communities that are disadvantaged in one way or another, because some of those stresses that kids experience when they're little, they can impact them for years and years and years. And how you counter that, how you inoculate kids against that is something that needs a lot of attention. And I personally think that's how we're going to grow a healthy world, by starting with the little kids. Yeah, we can't abandon kids who have been harmed when they're older, but the best payoff from my point of view is going to come from the earlier intervention. So that's one thing I want to talk about.
Okay.
Another thing is the need to really institutionalize the cultural perspective in every therapist's mind. And this is something where I have to admit, I think the field has progressed beyond when I was doing direct service. I think people think about cultural perspective more consistently than they used to. But I think that how you institutionalize that so that it's really an expectation is an important factor. And this, I'm particularly thinking about white therapists who come to the table with privilege. and with really sort of unexamined privilege, that there needs to be more training on how to do that systematically. I've read about the cultural formulation interview that's part of the DSM, but I don't know how widely it's used. It's a little cumbersome, but man, does it get the right questions, and pushes people to really think in a fairly deep way about the culture and the person that they're meeting with. So some practical form of that, I think, is really an important deal. And then lastly, and again, this is something that I think has changed over time, and hopefully CPN had a little part to play in that. The support systems for young BIPOC individuals who want to come into the therapy world as practitioners is really critical. And that goes all the way from generating interest in being a mental health professional. It hasn't always been the career of choice, and unfortunately you don't get rich doing this work, but you get rich as a person, but your wallet doesn't always get fat.
Right.
And all the support you need to succeed in the training and to pass that damn licensing exam and be respected by your colleagues. The system traditionally has not respected cultural knowledge as part of the important clinical knowledge base, and that's a big mistake. You should get significant credit for your cultural knowledge as well as your knowledge of DSM, whatever number we're at now, or ICD 10, whatever it is.
Yeah, I agree. I think the mental health world is starting to realize that now, but they're so far behind. And when we look at the DSM-5, there are some more cultural considerations in that book. However, there's a lot to be desired, and let's be honest, the mental health world is still following a model that is very Freudian. Jung has a lot of influence, and I would say Erickson are probably the big three that influence the most within the book. But those guys have been gone for a long time. And there's been a lot of change that has happened just in America. We'll just talk about the United States and American society, but also just culturally, American culture and these ethnicities that we have, that I do think that we need to consider a lot more cultural dynamics within there. I'll share a quick story with you. I don't know if I told you this before, but one of the main reason why I stopped doing clinical therapy is I got burnt out. I was a young therapist. Let's see, I was 31 when I stopped, 31, 32. I didn't have the best supervision. Me and my supervisor were kind of bumping heads because I'm explaining things like the things that I was using, my skill set. I was combining some of the hardcore book knowledge with some of the cultural things that just made sense to me to do with the mostly African American people that I'm working with. And she couldn't connect the dots at all. And I would just explain it, and we'll bump heads and supervision. And I'm just like, it's working. It's just like this. And she wasn't able to make that connection. And she was a Caucasian woman. She wasn't able to make the connection like I was. And it was very, very frustrating, to the point where I was just like, if I can't figure this out and I can't explain it to this person, how am I ever going to do this work? And I was starting to get burnt out. And I remember another thing that happened was I was doing so much just what I would consider beautiful therapeutic work with young people mainly. And, it was almost like not a blank slate, but I would say it was like hitting a reset button every 3 to 4 sessions sometimes, because we would just have these runs where we do great. And then they would return from return from school or something in the community. And it was like the skill sets, the techniques that we were working on, they just they couldn't do it because they were responding to like what you were saying, some of the trauma that's out there in the community or at home, or some of the adversities. And it was just like, man, like, I don't know if this is the level of impact that I can make. And that's why I decided to transition out of clinical therapy and try to do more bigger systematic work, because we have to change both, not just individuals, but we also have to work with groups and communities as well in a tandem to make a difference. And I think that that's a big opportunity for the mental health world to understand when it comes to community, and it comes to these cultural elements, is that it's not just the individual person. It's also some of the community dynamics that are happening as well, because people are responding to their environments all the time. So I think with your three things that you share with us, going upstream, working with some of those younger kids, trying to connect, earlier in the process is where you get the most bang for your buck. I agree with that 100%. And then definitely, institutionalize the cultural perspective of these of professionals and making sure that they're actually getting it. That's a huge one. Most master's degree level programs, they'll have the diversity course. They might not call it that. They may give it a different title, but they'll have that one course, and then you're expected to go get your professional development elsewhere. But we have to figure out ways to infuse it into the whole, process of getting that degree, because that's going to be important. Because let's be honest, a lot of times these folks get out of these programs, and you're right, they don't have the best paying job, and they're usually working with communities that they're not 100% familiar with. And that can be a very challenging thing for a new counselor or therapist to deal with, where they start to, question their own abilities. Like, can I even do this? Because they're kind of working outside of their cultural frame, because they didn't get that encouragement or that knowledge base or even the skill set anywhere. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And that's why we're doing this podcast, and we're attempting to bring back the Culture Providers Network in a way that people can get some of that information and hopefully craft some ideas to continue to forge forward, because we're needed more than ever, and the community is waiting for us, which is good.
The skill set that you're talking about, I guess I'd call it a meta skill. So it's not just what do you know, but it's what process do you use to come to understanding, and that's I don't know, my jargon, that'd be a meta skill.
Yeah.
And it's really critical. And I don't know. I'm hoping this is changing over the years. Back in when I was a young guy, I thought that if I knew a few facts about Somalia and I knew it was different than Ethiopia, that I was on my way to being culturally competent.
Right.
Yeah. that was very wrong.
Right.
Limited. Let me say, it was very limited in his perspective. And there's no substitute for actually being out there and engaging and listening.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I like that meta skills. We might have to circle back on that one and talk about more. What are some of those skills? That's an important factor. So I think you're right. I think there is a belief out there that as long as you just know a few facts about a group and you can differentiate between one group and another, that you're okay. And that can lead to some pretty awful experiences, unfortunately. So it's definitely something that we have to focus on.
Yeah. All
right. The last question I have for you, then we kind of wrap up our conversation for today. I know you're retired. You're enjoying life. Yeah. But are there any projects or initiatives that you like to point folks to? Anything that you're connected with, or things that you're aware of that folks should pay attention to in the mental health or well-being space?
Boy, I hate to disappoint about that, because I'm just, not only am I retired, so I'm sort of disconnected from the practice world, but as I moved into research, it really changed my focus in a lot of ways. So that there's a lot of things going on that I'm not aware of, or only tangentially aware of. So I don't have a really good answer for that question.
No,
I think that the one thing that was an eye opener for me when I left direct service with Ramsey County and moved over to the university was my really much deeper understanding of the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And that it was just beginning to be understood, and I hope that it's widely understood now, but I'm not sure that it is. Is it just such a critical factor that really points to the importance of early intervention. So anything that's going on in that area, I think, is really important. And I'm sorry, I don't have a more in-depth answer to that question.
No, that's perfect. I think ACEs is a perfect answer. Yeah, I am one of the state facilitator for adverse childhood experience. I think I was in the third cohort or the second, one of those two. So early adapter. That was a huge eye-opening experience for myself. It really, when I learned it, it really was a self-check for me. I was like, oh, I have a lot of these. I remember when we got trained in, they had us all take the ACE questionnaire, and I scored a 7, and I was like, oh,
Whoa.
man, yeah, that's pretty high, right?
Yeah.
So I had to, even as a professional, redesign my thinking around some of those things and what was happening. And I think that there's also some ACEs that were not on that list that I probably could check off as well,
Sure.
which is very interesting.
Interesting thing for somebody like you is that you will know better than I will, obviously, if how it's impacted you. But you still seem to be a successful, well-functioning, reasonably happy individual. So you found a way to overcome some of those early experiences, and I think that's where the huge knowledge gap is about what's necessary to really help communities inoculate their kids. Because you probably can't stop adverse childhood experiences from happening. You can decrease them, but we've got to be able to find a way to really consistently help kids grow beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. My quick answer for that question, it's a longer answer out there too, is something that I call post-traumatic growth. And it's not something that I created, it's something that's been out there for a while, but helping people live and thrive beyond the adversity that they experience is very important. I think I was very fortunate to not allow the trauma that I experienced to become my identity, but a part of just my journey. And I think that shift in mentality for someone, especially when you're younger, can help you prevail and move forward. And that's where a lot of the work that I do, even outside of MACMA, I try to help people understand, like, there's life beyond the traumatic experiences. And and one of the testimonies is that you're still here, that you still have an opportunity to do something beyond being victimized by whatever you experience. So yeah, there it is. All right, well, we're gonna wrap up. Joel, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for giving us some of your time, which is very valuable. We definitely wanted to get a nice historical perspective on CPN and talk to some of the originators of the process, especially as we're taking it in this newer direction. So again, thank you.
And thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right, that's gonna wrap us up for today's episode. We'll see you next time. Take care.